Hello, I'm Bill Dallas, and I want to welcome you to another CCN seminar. Today we are continuing our series on apologetics, featuring some of the best-known apologists of our day. At CCN, our goal is always to bring you the best training available on topics that will help you be prepared to engage the world effectively as a Christian. We went to the National Conference on Christian Apologetics at Hickory Grove Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, where we taped these training events live specifically for the CCN audience. This event was sponsored by Southern Evangelical Seminary, also located in Charlotte, North Carolina. In this section, Dr. Gary Habermas will help us understand the evidence for the resurrection and its impact on our lives. Before we take you to our training, let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Dr. Gary Habermas is Distinguished Professor and Chair of the Department of Philosophy and Theology at Liberty University. He's the author of more than 27 books, including The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus and Dealing with Doubt. He's regarded as the leading expert on the resurrection in the world. Let's go ahead now and join Dr. Habermas.
It's my privilege this morning to speak about the greatest event in the history of the world. So much so that if you are sure about the gospel of Jesus Christ, and when the gospel is defined in the New Testament, chiefly the book of Acts and the epistles of Paul, these three facts are always present in the definitions of the gospel. The deity of Christ, his atoning death, that's what the death of Jesus is, as it is here in the passage I'm going to use in a moment, 1 Corinthians 15, and his bodily resurrection from the dead. Deity, death, resurrection. If you have that down, you will have the center of Christianity. And I try to tell people when dealing with doubt, you can be unsure about questions out here in the periphery or this one out here. But if you're sure about the center, Christianity follows. So if we major in the major, we'll be validating the truth of Christianity. Now I'm going to vary a little bit from that outline in your book, but I don't think you'll have any problem following me today. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the way I just started, that's Paul, that's not me. That's the way Paul starts. First two verses, he says, when I came to Corinth, I gave you the gospel which I preached. And he says, it's this simple. If you have said yes to Jesus Christ, then you're a Christian. And if not, you have believed in vain. That's how he starts. It's all about this. And then verse 3, he said, I delivered unto you that which I also received of first importance. I believe Paul is saying this is the center of Christianity. And he says, verse 3, he said, Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He rose again the third day according to the Scriptures. And he appeared. And here comes a list. This is possibly the most commented on text in the entire New Testament. This has an incredible amount of scholarly attention, even from those who do not believe the resurrection. And let me tell you something. The tide is turning, I think. There's a lot of loose bolts that have to be adjusted. But the tide is turning in favor of the resurrection. I was talking to a person the other day, and we were mentioning, actually, this guy was one of the intelligent design scientists, and his book was voted the top book of the year a couple years ago, and he said, isn't it amazing what the Lord is bringing about in contemporary apologetics? And we thought for a moment. He said, Alvin Plantinga's Revolution of Philosophy. He said, Bill Dembski and Michael Behe in Intelligent Design. He said, historical Jesus gains. He said, look at what's happened to the present world. Well, let me tell you a little bit about the historical Jesus gains. A few months ago, I was invited to come down to Duke Divinity School, not too far from here, to dialogue with one of their professors on the resurrection of Jesus. And the invite came from the Divinity School, not from Samaria Church or somebody like that. And they said, come on down and talk to us, and we want to see some of the contrast between what you teach at Liberty University and what we teach at Duke Divinity School. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. But then they cautioned me. Listen to this caution. The guy who invited me said, by the way, don't look for huge differences between you and the professor from Duke. They said, no professor at Duke will deny the resurrection of Jesus. A couple months after that, February, I was teaching at a university. A couple months after that, it was July, and I was teaching at a university in Strasbourg, and one of my students just left Cambridge, was studying at Cambridge. And he walked up to me and he said, hey, I just talked to Graham Stanton last week, one of the top New Testament scholars in the world, and he said, Graham Stanton told me that none of the Cambridge professors in his particular college will deny the resurrection. Now, we'd have to talk about what deny the resurrection means, but listen, if you can say that at Duke Divinity School and at Cambridge University, something has happened. In fact, I've been surveying for the last almost 10 years now, surveying every source in print on the resurrection of Jesus in German, French, and English from 1975 to the present, about 2,500 scholarly sources. In fact, a couple of my research assistants are down here, and one of them's got this project right now. He's been working on 70 of these articles for the last 3 months, digesting these things and kind of color-coding them. There's a lot to be said. In fact, just downloading what the scholars' views are takes 600 pages. There's over 100 subtopics on the death and resurrection of Jesus. And this material I'm going to share with you today, I can tell you this because I love it when critics say, how do you speak for critical scholars? How do you know what the majority of critical scholars say? And I'll respond, I counted. Have you done that? You count. It might take you 10 years, but count. Do the research. And the material I'm going to share with you today, most of it is agreed to by probably 95 to 99% of all scholars writing today. So sometimes I give this lecture, and I call it, you can see there, I call it the resurrection evidence that changed a generation. It's this passage in Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, that has made people realize we are really talking about something special here. Okay, with that introduction, let's start doing it this way. If someone said to me, what's the best evidence for the resurrection? This will not be the normal resurrection evidence kind of talk you hear, because what's going on today is different than that. Now here's the way, I'm going to contrast this, here's the way many, if not most evangelicals will give this argument. Let's call this right here, let's call this event ground zero. This is 30 AD, 32 AD, 33 AD. There are different dates given for the death of Jesus. But let's call this ground zero, and 30 is a nice round number and the number that's mostly used. Let's say 30 AD. And the average evangelical argues like this. Look, we've got good sources for the resurrection from a fairly early date. We've got Mark, even if you use critical dating, and most evangelicals want to say these deserve to be moved back about 10 years. But they'll say, look, we've got Mark from 70, subtract 30, that's only plus 40 years. And one of the major signs of historiography, Josh asked us last night, what's a good definition of history? You need two things for a good definition of history. You need an event and you need a report. And the early report here is about plus 40. 40 years after the event. Then, using critical dating, I think these dates need to be moved back, in the case of Luke and Matthew, need to be moved back 20 years. But critics will say, well look, Matthew's at 80, Luke's at 85, and then pretty much everybody puts John at about 95. So the classical argument goes, we have early eyewitness data, you heard this from Josh a little bit last night, plus 40, plus 50, plus 55, and plus 65. And they'll say, hey look, this is good for ancient history. And I'll tell you it is good for ancient history. For example, if you check ancient sources, consider the following. The best known biography of Alexander the Great is that by Plutarch, and it is written 400 years after Alexander. And nobody says, baloney, we can't learn anything from a source 400 years later. People don't say that. Try another one. The Caesar who's on the throne when Jesus dies is Tiberius. We have about 9 total sources for Tiberius. We have way more than that for Jesus, but they're contemporaries. About 9 total sources for Tiberius. 4 major sources for Tiberius, 4 Gospels. Let's do a little comparison. The earliest source for Tiberius is contemporary. That's good. A general who writes about Tiberius, that's a good source. But guess what? He gives us less information than anybody else. He's the least useful source. The next sources for Tiberius on the same timeline, because Tiberius is also down there in the 30s. He died just a few years after Jesus. The next best source is Tacitus at plus 80 off the stage. Next best source, Suetonius, 85 off the stage. And the fourth best source for Tiberius, Dio Cassius, 180 years later, down on the wall down there. Now that's Tiberius, and this is Jesus, so this argument makes some sense. But what I want to say is this. We've got Gospels that critics start dating about here, I think deserve to be dated back here. But if you take this passage from Paul, I'll tell you where we are in Pauline studies today. Paul is the critic's darling. Even the most rabid critic will give you 6 to 8 of the 13 books that bear Paul's name. G.A. Wells passed away recently, I believe, but he's the well-known critic, the hypercritic we might say, who denies or doubts Jesus' existence. And he gives you 8 of Paul's epistles. You can be that critical to the left of the Jesus Seminar and give you 8 of Paul. But you know, when they give you 8, they'll always give you the major Pauline books you want. Everybody concedes Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians. They always give you those. I want to use just 2 texts today from this corpus that nobody's going to question. 1 Corinthians 15 and the end of Galatians 1, beginning of Galatians 2. Those few verses were about 15 verses right in there. No one questions the Pauline authority. Now, whatever you do with the Gospels, the critics not only think that Paul is much earlier, but they will concede that whoever the authors are of these, and they're going to dispute with us about whether the authors are disciples of the 2 of the 4 Gospels, but they allow that Paul is an eyewitness. Nobody in contemporary theology disputes this next sentence. Paul had an experience which he believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. In fact, virtually nobody, about 99% if I had to guess, will dispute this sentence. All the disciples had experiences which they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Can you imagine how close that is to the resurrection? You just have to make sure nothing else explains it. But I want to use Paul today. Mark and the Gospels are wonderful, but Paul starts this about here because 1 Corinthians 15 is dated about, give or take, 55 AD. 55. So we're at plus 25. Now, let's just stop for a moment. Ancient history with a source from just 25 years? Hans von Kampenhausen, a liberal German historian, says 1 Corinthians 15 gives you all the material that an ancient historian could possibly require. What a comment. And it starts with the fact that it's only 25 years later. All right, let's move on. Paul says, first 2 verses, I gave you the same message when I came to you and preached for the first time. Oh, okay. So this is when Paul wrote it down. When did he come to Corinth for the first time? About 51. So now we're at plus 21. And I hope you know what we're working toward here. I want to show you that there's very, very early eyewitness material for the resurrection. That's where I'm heading. And so the early part we're working on right now, and Paul preached this at plus 21. But Paul says, verse 3, I gave you as of first importance that which I also received. He says this one other time in his epistles, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, talking about the communion, the Last Supper. And these words are technical words, the Aramaic equivalent. They are technical words for passing on tradition. Who did Paul study under? Gamaliel. He's a first-rate scholar. And Paul is using words that rabbis use for passing on tradition. There's about 8 to 10 literary reasons why this material is taken to be much earlier than Paul's epistles. And if there's one unanimous conclusion in the New Testament studies today, it's that 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following is based on material that is much, much earlier than the book in which it appears. One reason is because Paul flat out says, and that Paul's the darling, Paul says, this isn't my material. I gave you what I was given. Okay, well, when did he write it again? Plus 25. When did he speak it? Plus 21. How early is this material? In other words, when did he get it and from whom? Most critical scholars who answer this question believe that Paul received this material about 35 AD, or plus 5. Where do you get that? First of all, evangelicals not come up with this argument. That's just amazing. We took a look at it after it was first given several decades ago, and now it's just common parlance in studies. But let me tell you where the conclusion comes from. Turn it with me, if you would, to Galatians chapter 1, the other text. The question is, where and from whom did Paul get this material right here? That's the question. Where and from whom? Paul says, Galatians chapter 1, he's talking about the gospel, which Paul said that's the center of his preaching. He says, I came to Christ, 1:16. He said, I did not go running up to Jerusalem right away to see the other apostles. I went out into the desert and spent 3 years with the Lord, and then I went to Jerusalem. Let's do the timeline ourselves. Paul is very careful. We start with the death of Jesus. When was Paul converted? Scholars put that at about 2 to 3 years after the cross. Paul says, for 3 more years, I went off alone with the Lord. 2 plus 3, some date his conversion as early as 1 year after. 2 plus 3, he goes to Jerusalem, chapter 1, verse 18, Galatians. He goes to Jerusalem about 35 AD. Now let me just answer an objection here briefly. I get this question more than almost any other question about the data, and it goes like this. You Christians always assume the inspiration of this book before you start talking. The objection goes like this. You want me to believe the man? Yeah, the man's in the book. Well, I don't believe the book, so I don't believe the man. Well, several of our speakers, 2 out of 3 last night, have already addressed this. But let me just tell you something that a lot of people, unless you get into it and study this, they're not aware of this. Nobody, no critics, no scholars, no one will not let you that's a double negative. Okay. Everyone will let you use this book. Here's the principle. Here's the principle. You can use this book, even the harshest critic will say, you can use those passages for which you have backup. So don't sit there and say, yeah, but he's using the text. What if the text's not inspired? Take it as a letter from Paul. That's what the most radical critics do. Just take it as a statement and ask with me as we go through this if there's some backup for this. Okay? Paul's writing this epistle from the 50s, 1 Corinthians. He spoke it even earlier in the 50s. But in Galatians chapter 1, he says, I received this material when I went to Jerusalem. Really? Does he say that? Well, let's take a look. Verse 18, he says, then I went up to Jerusalem, and I spent 15 days with Peter and James, the brother of Jesus. Now, right here, we have 3 of the biggest 4 names in the early church, 3 of the most authoritative names. Paul, James, the brother of Jesus, Peter. Only John is missing, and he's going to come on the scene early in Galatians chapter 2. So we'll pick John up. Right now, the big 3 are there. And what are they discussing? Well, first rule of interpretation, you always interpret a text in its context. And Paul is talking about the nature of the gospel. Before and after, he's talking about the gospel. Besides, what would Paul talk about spending 15 days with Peter? C.H. Dodd, a critical scholar of the last generation, New Testament professor at Cambridge, said in a beautiful quote, he said, Paul spent 15 days with Peter, and it's safe to say they did more than talk about the weather. That's a great quote. What would you talk about for 15 days with Peter? You know the first question I'd ask him? Hey, Peter, I'm a persecutor. I don't deserve to be called an apostle, but if I understand correctly, you denied our Lord 3 times. You and I have something in common here. I just wonder, how did Jesus look when you first saw him? You know that famous Christian song that was written about 20 years ago, He's Alive? It's speaking on Peter's behalf, and Peter's kind of moping around on what we call Holy Saturday. I think the disciples were disillusioned. Peter's kind of moping around, and he says, even if he were alive, it wouldn't mean a thing. I can understand that kind of attitude. He's denied the Lord 3 times. He's down, and he's saying nothing makes any sense. But Paul wants to know, what difference does it make when you saw him on Sunday? Well, in the song, Peter says, he's alive, he's alive, he's alive. I'm forgiven, and heaven's gates are open wide. You see, it's a point I started with today. There's a direct argument from truth to application. Direct argument in apologetics from truth to application. If it's true, my sins can be forgiven, and I can live with the Lord forever. What a great argument. Well, Paul goes to spend 15 days with Peter, and they talk about the gospel. And critics believe that Paul either got this sequence discussed there in 1 Corinthians 15:3 and following. He either received it here, or he received the material on which it was based. Either way, it clearly, Paul's reception of it now, clearly dates from AD 35. Now, in Galatians chapter 2, just a few years later, Paul goes back up to Jerusalem, and I think Galatians 2:2 is one of the most incredible verses in the entire New Testament. I like the King James wording here. Paul says, I went up to Jerusalem and set before the disciples the gospel that I was preaching to see if I was running or had run in vain. Wow! Paul, you've been preaching for all these years, and you want to know if you've been preaching the right gospel? Don't you think you ought to check that out back there? And Paul says, I did. You're not listening. Galatians chapter 1. First of all, I got it from the Lord. Secondly, I got it from them. I'm going up a 3rd time. And depending on what you do with Acts chapter 15, some scholars believe Acts 15 is the same as Galatians 2. Some scholars believe that it's different than Galatians 2. If it's the same, we have a backup for this trip. If it's different, Paul has now made 3 trips to Jerusalem for this purpose. Are we sure about this gospel? I love Paul. He needs to be at this apologetics conference. My first course in heaven is going to be resurrection, post-Pauline studies. This guy is careful. He's a good scholar, and he spends time with the Lord. He goes up to Jerusalem just 5 years after the cross, and he goes up to Jerusalem again. And folks, he's a top-notch scholar. He's the Ph.D. in this group of 4. Because John's with him now in Galatians chapter 2. Can you imagine Peter looking out the window and seeing Paul come up again? Oh, guys, here comes Paul. This guy wears me out. James, you're the brother of the Lord. Will you please talk to him? Not me, man. He wears me out too. John, the newcomer in Galatians 2. John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Why don't you go, hey, Paul, how you doing, man? We're sure glad to see you. And Paul says, guys, I've only come for one reason. I know, we know. You want to know if the gospel's true. You know, there's a great verse there. He set before them the gospel to make sure they were all on the same page. Look at the answer, Galatians 2:6. They added nothing to me. They added nothing to me. Verses 9 and 10. This is where we get the phrase. They gave us the right hand of fellowship. Paul, we're all on the same page. Do you know how strong this conclusion is? We don't do this in apologetics, but we need to talk about the connection between 1 Corinthians 15 and Galatians chapters 1 and 2. Because you take the 4 biggest names in the early church, 3 of whom had denied their Lord. right? We've talked about Paul. We talked about Peter. How about James, the brother of Jesus? According to skeptics, let alone evangelicals, he was an unbeliever until he met the risen Jesus. Mark chapter 3, John chapter 7, two independent sources. Jesus Seminar says if you get two independent sources, you've got a better argument, good argument for the historical Jesus. We have two texts that say James was an unbeliever. Mark 3 is really strong. When Jesus came to town, his brothers wanted to just get him out of the way quietly because they thought he was, the wording there, they thought he was beside himself. The old word for nuts. Just don't embarrass us anymore. That's James. And so the big four are here. Peter, who denied his Lord. James, who was an unbeliever. Paul, who was a skeptic with basically a Ph.D. in Old Testament. And here's John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. Folks, do we appreciate the force of these four guys getting together in a critically allowed? Galatians is undeniably by Paul. Paul undeniably knows these guys. Nobody denies any of this. And they agree on the force of the gospel. And more importantly, they agree on the content of the gospel. Now, this is them, James, Peter, John, approving Paul. Look what happens in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 11. After Paul gives this long list, and he says, I don't deserve to be an apostle because I persecuted the church of Christ, but still, Jesus Christ chose me. And then he says this amazing thing in 1 Corinthians 15:11. He's talking about the resurrection appearances. And he says, whether it's I or them, who? The apostles. Speaking about what? The appearances. Whether it's me, whether it's Peter, whether it's John, whether it's James, this is what we teach and this is what you believe. Do you know what Paul's saying? If you don't want to get it from me, that's fine. Go ask Peter. Go ask John. Go ask James. Because we're giving the same message. Folks, this argument is powerful because it goes like this. Critics want, everyone wants, early eyewitnesses. You got the big four, all eyewitnesses, and you've got them giving Paul the right hand of fellowship, the three giving one, the right hand of fellowship and adding nothing to them. Then you got Paul saying later, hey, they're preaching the same thing I am. I know what they're about. We're all preaching the same message. There is nothing like that evidential overlap anywhere in ancient religion. Anywhere where you've got the eyewitnesses corresponding to and confirming each other. Powerful, powerful argument. And three of the four were former skeptics, unbelievers, or in Peter's case, had taken a fall and denied his Lord. A good argument. Okay, now, let me cite some people who are not known in our circles for being very conservative. Let me start with the Jesus Seminar. They deny 80 to 90%, depending on how you interpret the color coding, they deny 80 to 90% of the red letter words of Jesus. What do they say about this? You're just citing these critical scholars all over the place. Surely you're just talking about moderates and evangelicals, right? All right, let's talk about the Jesus Seminar. After they did the words of Jesus, they did a book called The Acts of Jesus. Remember the color code. Red means yes. Pink means probably. Gray means probably not. Black means no way. All right, I'm interested in the first two. Red is yes, pink is probably. They take these two passages, one in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 8. He appeared to me, Paul says, and 1 Corinthians 9:1. Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord? They take those two passages. Paul saw Jesus. Guess what they color code this? Red. Hear me? Jesus Seminar. Red. Go down a little bit. He appeared first to Peter. What color is that? Pink. You know why it's only pink? You know why it's only probable and not red? Only because we hear Peter's testimony from Paul. We don't get it from Peter's own mouth. Now they don't concede 1 Peter and so on. But they do think that's Peter's testimony. Now, hear what I'm saying? These guys deny 90% of the words of Jesus, and yet they say, Jesus appeared to Paul. Yes. He appeared to Peter. Probably. And then they say in their notes, we need to add another group in here, the women. The fact that Jesus appeared to the women is a very strong argument. This is a Jesus seminar saying Jesus appeared to people. Well, how about this? Surely this is just something evangelicals agree to, right? That Paul got this material in the 30s AD? Well, how about a couple more dates for you? Garrett Ludeman, an atheistic New Testament scholar who chided the Jesus seminar for being too conservative. How's that one? Garrett Ludeman says this material dates from 33 AD. Garrett Ludeman. And the Jesus seminar, answering the question, where does this material date from? They believe Paul got it about here, but where does it date to? Jesus seminar, before Paul's conversion. Folks, gospel arguments are great arguments. They help us. But we are right down here to 32 AD. Now watch this. James D.G. Dunn, one of the 3 or 4 most influential New Testament scholars today. Larry Hurtado, another one in that category. And Gerald O'Collins, a theologian. None of them evangelical. Hurtado, Dunn, and Collins. You know what the latest conclusion is about this material in 1 Corinthians 15? This stuff just came out. This material dates, they say, from 30 AD. You say, well, of course it dates from 30 AD. That's when Jesus was died and raised again. That's not what they're talking about. They're talking about when did it reach this stylized form that was passed on. How long did it take them to incorporate this into a stylized message? 30 AD. Do you folks realize what comes out of this argument? 30 AD? Early? You kidding me? When the best-known biography of Alexander is 400 years later, when the best sources for Tiberius Caesar are 80 to 180 years later, and we get a report concerning the gospel from the very year it happened? This is a Liberty University date, right? This is an SES date, right? No. I mean, is it okay with you if we use an atheistic New Testament scholar, the Jesus seminar, and 2 of the most influential theologians in the world? This is an extremely powerful argument. And then don't forget, that's just when it got noised abroad. You've got the top 4 witnesses doing this meshing, confirming each other, and saying it's true. Folks, there is nothing like this in the ancient world. And what does it concern? Not some periphery teaching of Christianity, but 1 Corinthians 15:3, it concerns the message which is of primary importance to Christians. It's the message of the deity, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Flip with me, if you would, in the last couple minutes here, to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Into the chapter, I started this message today, I want to come full circle. Started the message by saying, the best combination in the world is when you have facts and application. When you know what you believe, why you believe it, you have a solid foundation, and it makes the utmost difference in your life. All the way from now till heaven. You tell me what message is better than that. So Paul, at the end of this passage, Paul starts making applications. I just see there that I got a few more minutes than I thought I did. So let me back up just a little bit with Paul. If you look at verses 12 through 20, Paul says, look at everything that depends on the resurrection. He says, if Christ has not been raised from the dead, your faith is vain. Verse 14. He says it again, verse 17. He says, we are found false witnesses if Christ is not raised. Verse 18. This one hurts because my wife passed away with stomach cancer in 1995. Paul says, verse 18, if Christ has not been raised, your loved ones have died in vain. You'll never see him again. Do you ever think when Paul tells us in his Thessalonian correspondence, when Paul says, we grieve but not like those without hope? Did you ever think about the difference between grieving with hope and grieving without hope? Christians die, but the resurrection ensures eternity. Verse 18. Verse 19 may be the most pessimistic verse in the entire Bible. Paul says, if in this life only we have hope, we are of all men most to be questioned, despised. You believe something, you give your whole life to, it's not true. But verse 20, he starts a new paragraph there, and he says, but Christ has been raised from the dead, and he's the first fruits of those asleep. You folks, you see what happens? If the resurrection has been raised, if Jesus has been raised from the dead, everything Paul just said for the previous 8 verses is reversed. Your faith is not in vain because it's grounded. Your witnessing, verse 15, is not in vain. Your faith is not in vain again, verse 17. Verse 18, your loved ones who died in Christ have not died in vain. They have the ultimate hope. Everything stands or falls with the resurrection. A few verses later, he talks about ethics. Verses 32, 33, 34, and he says, if the dead are not raised, let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. That's a quote from the Old Testament. You may not realize, you might probably thought that phrase was invented in the 60s or something. But it's been around for a long time. And Paul says if Christ has not been raised from the dead, I'm getting ready to work on a book with an ethicist in our department that argues that the resurrection is the foundation for Christian ethics. Paul says if Christ has not been raised from the dead, we don't have any reason for acting Christianly. Let us eat and drink, for tomorrow we die. Our ethics are grounded in the resurrection. Folks, with the resurrection message, we have everything. Without the resurrection message, we have nothing. We are, verse 19, of all men most to be despised. All right, so for the next 30 verses, Paul discusses the doctrine which is linked to the resurrection more than any other doctrine in the New Testament. Almost 20 times, not 20 verses, almost 20 times, Paul says, Paul and other New Testament authors, the New Testament says almost 20 times, we will be raised like Jesus. Almost 20 times. And so from verses 50 on, Paul's discussing immortality. The word immortality means deathlessness. You will never die. It'd be hard to find a more positive word in the New Testament. And yet, half of all the times that word is used in the New Testament is used right here, 1 Corinthians 15. And Paul comes down to verse 58, and he says, because of the resurrected Jesus, he says 3 things. He says, number 1, stand fast. Be steadfast. Folks, some of you know, Alex has already told you, I've done a couple books on doubt. By the way, they're both books out of print. One's on the table back there, but both books are out of print, but they're both on my website, GaryHabermas.com. You can get it free of charge. If you can use it with people, I'd be tickled for you to use that material. But I've studied doubt for 20 years. I work with a clinical psychologist. We've been testing this. The vast majority of doubt is emotional in nature. And C.S. Lewis says when people walk away from Christ, when they apostatize, he says they don't walk away because they get argued out of something. They walk away because of sin, peer pressure, or emotional hurt. Is that why Paul says in 1558, first conclusion he draws, stand fast? Folks, we have the most incredible message in the world. The message that says, it's true now. Eternal life starts now, but you haven't seen anything yet. That's the best message in the world. Stand fast. Secondly, he says your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Some evangelicals disagree on this, but I believe that what we do with Christ after salvation is going to determine, to some extent, the quality of our worship and the quality of our service in heaven. You better believe our labor in the Lord is not in vain. Paul says, number 1, hang in there. Number 2, your labor in the Lord is not in vain. And then let me back up a few verses for his last point. He says, because Christ has been raised, we will be raised. Folks, many of you sitting here have lost loved ones. I can't think of a more precious promise in the universe. But let me tell you something. When Paul cites those words also from the Old Testament, read the commentaries, Paul is not citing these words like a poet. He's not doing this. Oh, death, where is your sting? Oh, grave, where is your victory? Hey, listen, I have no problem with poetry, but you need to know something about me. I was the ice hockey coach at Liberty University for 9 years. There's a different side to Christianity here. And Paul is not talking like a poet. Again, read the commentaries. Seriously, Paul is taunting death. Paul is taunting the devil. If you will, he is trash talking. Now, the problem with trash talking is that it's all about me, and that's why we don't like it. But Paul's not talking about himself. Verse 57, thanks be to God, the victory comes through Jesus, not me. So here's what Paul is doing. My third and final application point, stand firm. Your labor and labor is not in vain. And thirdly, death. You got something on me? You got nothing. You've got, yes, I hurt. My wife died in 1995. I hurt. But you are a loser. You lost. Look at the score. That's Jesus up there. He's raised. You lost. You've got nothing on me. Nothing. You're going down. Oh, what? What? You're going to kill me? Huh. I think I've got that covered. In one of my critically acclaimed epistles, Philippians chapter 1 says, for me to live is Christ. I heard a lot of sermons on that. Never heard a sermon on 121b. To die is gain. You want to kill me? Thanks for the favor. Oh, what? You're letting me stay around a little bit? I cover that too, because as long as you let me stay around, I'm going to keep working for the kingdom. So, my conclusion is, Paul says, you lose. Yes, I hurt. I won't deny that. I hurt. Life is painful. But it's the bad news. You lost. He was raised. We win. You lose. And someday, I will live forever, and you can't touch me. Beat that. Verse 57. All because of Jesus Christ. Folks, there's no better message in the world. It's that opening sentence, and I'll end with this. Christianity is just not true. It's applicable. And not just applicable to the future. It starts when you come to Christ. Stay steadfast. Work for the Lord. And one day we'll be with him forever. I end with the words of our Lord, John chapter 14, verse 19. Because I live, ye shall live also.
What a tremendous message about the evidence of the resurrection. We want to thank you for joining us today for this special broadcast of Dealing with Doubt with Dr. Gary Habermas. If you want to find out more about Southern Evangelical or about the National Conference on a Christian Apologetics, go to www.scs.edu. To find out more about Dr. Habermas and to find more resources, go to www.garyhabermas.com. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.